Hey friends, David Schimmel here. Today I'm going to show you 4 basic workflows for making drum beats in Ableton. We're only going to need stock samples and effects for this one, so let's get into it. For each of these examples, we're going to make a house beat, so set your project tempo to 128. And for our first workflow, we're going to do it by adding audio samples directly into the arrangement view in the pattern that we want. So start off with an audio track. If your project doesn't already have one, you can press Control-T if you're on Windows or Command-T if you're on Mac to create a new one. You can also right-click in here and select Insert Audio Track. And select the track, press Control-R to rename it to Kick. And make sure your grid is at 1/4 resolution, so you can hold down Control and spin the mouse wheel forward to zoom in. And now we've got a 1/4 note resolution grid. Now go into your audio library and pick any old kick sample. Doesn't really matter which one it is. Sure, that's good. And click and drag it onto the first beat of measure 17. So now we're gonna copy and paste this a few times. So one way to do that, first we're gonna make sure the sample only lasts a single beat. Then we're gonna select it and press Control-D to duplicate it. You can also hold Shift to select multiple samples, press Control-C to copy them, then put your cursor here at beat number 3 and press Control-V to paste. So that sounds like this. And if we don't want to have to keep pressing spacebar to play and stop our track, we can select this measure and press Control-L to turn on looping mode for that measure. You can toggle it with this icon here in the UI. And that way it'll keep looping after we play, and we can make adjustments on the fly that we like to the loop. So that sounds like this. Okay, we got our kick, so now let's add a snare. So create a new audio track, rename it to snare, and grab a snare sample from your library. All right, that sounds fine. We're gonna put that one on the 2nd and 4th beat here. So I'm gonna select beats 1 and 2 and press Control-D to duplicate. Now I have this pattern. Cool. Next, we're gonna add open hi-hats on every other 8th note in order to get that boots and cats kind of sound. So new audio track, rename to open hat. Make sure your grid is on 1/8, and then go in your library and find an open hat sample you like. Sure. Grab that, put it on the first 8th note, and I'm gonna shorten it here. I'm gonna grab the end and shorten the sample, and then select the first beat and duplicate it 3 more times. So now that sounds like this. Cool. And we'll fill in some more space here with some 16th note closed hi-hats to give it a little bit more motion. So we want another audio track, rename to closed hat, and we'll find a closed hat sample that we like. All right, drag that in there. Make sure we're selecting 1/16th note and then duplicate that. Don't put a hi-hat, a closed hat on the same beat as an open hat, because then the sounds will clash because they occupy similar parts of the frequency spectrum. And also it's physically impossible to play a hi-hat in both closed and open position at the same time. So with this one selected, press the right arrow key to move it over 1/16th note. And now we can select this whole beat and duplicate it 3 more times. So now we get this sound. Let's do a little bit of mixing. Bring down the open hat, bring up the closed hat. Let's see what we got. Okay. Now, of course, in a song, you wouldn't have your drums only last for a single measure. So if we want to extend this out to, say, 8 bars, we can select the whole measure on all the tracks and duplicate it 7 more times. And then if you were working on an 8-bar loop, you could then extend your loop out to cover those 8 bars. So the nice thing about this approach is that it's very visible, it's very immediate, right? All the sounds that you're using are right here in front of you, and you can see exactly what's playing and how they're lined up. But one of the downsides is that it lacks flexibility. So if I don't like this snare sample and I want to go in and replace it, I have to go in and remove all of these and then paste in a bunch of new snare samples. So what we gain in immediacy and visibility, we lose in flexibility. So in our next workflow, we're going to show how to address that using Midi. For this one, we're going to use Midi tracks instead of audio tracks. Midi is a communications protocol that lets different digital instruments and effects communicate with each other. So we're going to send Midi messages to trigger the desired audio samples that we want. So if you don't have a Midi track in your project already, press Ctrl-Shift-T to insert one. Or you can right-click here and say Insert Midi track. And double-click on the track, and you'll see this segment over here that says Drop Instrument here. So we're going to grab a kick sample again and drop it in here, which looks like this. Make sure to grab an audio sample. Okay. Click and drag that in here. And you'll notice that it creates this new instrument, which is called a sampler, which allows you to play back any kind of audio sample you want at various pitches. So now I'm going to draw a 4 on the floor grid using MIDI notes. So zoom in till you can select this one measure again, and right click and select Insert Empty MIDI Clip. This will open up a piano roll here, and because I have the scale turned on and I'm in C major, you can see that it highlights the notes of the C major scale. You'll also see that the grid is set to 1/16 by default, but I'm going to change it to 1/4 because I only want to insert quarter notes for the kick drum. One thing to note about Sampler is that the MIDI note C3 triggers the sample at its original pitch. And since we don't want to play the kick drum at a different pitch, we're going to use C3 here. So press the B key on your keyboard to switch from selection mode to drawing mode, which changes this pencil icon up here in the corner. And then go ahead and draw a MIDI note at C3 in each column. You'll notice down here that there's a section for velocity, and velocity is basically the MIDI equivalent of volume. So the higher the velocity, the louder the note will sound. So I'm gonna switch back to selection and press Control and click down here in the velocity section and press Control A to select them all, and then drag them up to the top so that they're all at the same velocity. That sounds like this. And of course we can loop it. Now if we don't like that sample, we can just drag another one here into the sampler and replace it. So let's say I want maybe that one, drag it in here. Now I got this. And of course you can increase the volume of the sampler with this knob down here. So maybe I'll bring it up a couple decibels. Cool. So next we're going to add the snare. So create a new MIDI track and find a snare sample in your library. Okay, drag that in there. Select this measure. Press Ctrl-Shift-M to insert a new MIDI clip. And again, we want quarter note resolution for the grid. So another way to do that is to press Ctrl-2 to decrease the size of the grid. So now you can see it's at 1/4. And I'm going to put the snare on the second and fourth beats. I'm going to move the velocities up to 127. So here we go. That sounds like this. All right, and let's continue with the open and closed hats. So, hat. Okay, or maybe this one. Draw another measure. Switch to eighth note resolution. And put a note on every other eighth note. Get this. And one last MIDI track for the closed hats. Sixteenth notes. 1, 2, skip this one, 3. Select these 4 and duplicate them and max out their volumes again. Get this. Cool. So one thing that having a MIDI version of this drum beat also lets us do is we can add what's called groove to the MIDI clip. So if you go down here to your browser and you select grooves, these are various rhythmic adjustments you can apply to MIDI data that can add a more organic or human or funky kind of feel to the rhythm of that MIDI clip. So I'm going to go down here to swing 16ths. I like 66. You can hear what that sounds like with the preview. And I'm going to click and drag that onto the closed hat MIDI clip. So now you can see the groove shows up here in this panel. If I click on the MIDI clip, you can see that I have the groove applied here, down here in this palette. And together that sounds like this. You can feel how the closed hats now have this swung, funky, groovy kind of rhythm to them. Another thing this technique lets us easily do is to layer sounds together to get beefier, more complex sounds. So if we open up our snare track, we can layer a clap sample on top of the snare by selecting the simpler instance, clicking up here. Press Ctrl G to group it to a new instrument rack. If you click this button, you can expand it and see that there's a single track here in the rack for the snare. And now if we grab a clap from our library and drag it in here, it creates another channel in our instrument rack for just the clap. And now this single MIDI note will trigger both the snare and the clap. So if we turn the clap up a little bit, we'll be able to hear what that sounds like here. If we mute the clap, it sounds like this. So it's a nice way to add some extra texture and complexity to sounds without having to create a whole new audio track and then copy and paste a bunch of the additional samples into place. So that kind of illustrates some of the additional flexibility that this approach gives us compared to the audio-only workflow. But you can see that there's still one track per instrument, which can start to get out of hand if you have a lot of drums going on. So for our third workflow, I'll show you how to consolidate all the drum sounds into a single track. For our third workflow, we're going to use another of Ableton's built-in instruments called the drum rack. To start, do a search in the Explorer for Kit, and then select the drums segment of your library. You'll see that Ableton comes with a bunch of preset drum kits that sound really good, and you can click on one of them, or you can click on any of them to preview them. So now if I click and drag this onto the MIDI channel here, you'll see that it automatically populates the channel with the drum kit. And what Drum Rack basically is it's 128 instances of Simpler, each one with its own drum pad associated with it. This is kind of like old sampling hardware like the Akai MPC. And then you can click and drag samples from your library onto any of the empty pads here, or if there's already a sample on the pad, it'll replace that sample with the new one that you dragged onto there. So you can preview what the samples sound like here. And if we want to create one from scratch, we can start by deleting this from the MIDI channel, and then we'll search for drum rack. Click and drag that onto here. Now we have a blank canvas to work from. So I'm going to add kick, snare, clap, and open and closed hi-hat samples here. And now that I've got my drum kit set up, if I like that, I can press this little save button here, and it'll store it in my user library under the drum rack instrument. So I can name it my house drum kit. All right, so now I'm going to zoom in again here on the arrangement view, create an empty MIDI clip that's 1 measure long. And you'll see here that since I'm using the drum rack, it only puts rows in place where we actually have samples on the drum pad, which simplifies things compared to just using Simpler directly. So let's recreate the drum beat again. Switch to 1/4, draw in the kicks, and we'll draw in the snares. We'll put a clap on the 4th beat here so that it layers nicely with the snare and adds some extra emphasis at the end of the drum loop. And then we'll switch to 16th notes, or sorry, 8th notes for the open hats, and 16th notes for the closed hats. All right, it sounds like this. Probably turn up the closed hat a little bit. And of course you can apply a groove to this entire clip as well. So we'll bring our swing 16ths onto here. And if we want to extend this MIDI clip out, this pattern, we can hover over the upper right corner of the clip and drag it out, let's say 4 to 4 bars. And you'll see it puts these little tick marks here, which indicate that the pattern is repeating itself, but it's not a distinct copy. So if we go in and edit the bass MIDI clip, say remove the last of these hi-hats, you'll see that it updates in all the linked copies of the clip. That sounds like this. So this approach helps keep everything together. We have all the drums here in one place, we can see them all, but there's no logical separation to them. If we want to process the higher frequency elements separately from the lower frequency ones, then we don't have an easy way to do that. So in the 4th and final workflow, I'll show you a hybrid approach where we combine all the different techniques that we've seen so far. The idea behind this last approach is to organize the samples into logically related groups. So to start, I'll put the kick in a simpler on its own channel. So rename this to kick. Grab a kick from the library. Put that there. Next, I'm going to add a new MIDI track and call it snares and claps. And on this one, I'm going to put a drum rack for putting all my snares and claps together. So let me grab a snare and a clap. I'll make another one for the hi-hats and other high-frequency elements, which are collectively referred to as tops. And I'll put another drum rack there. And then let me grab a closed hat. Turn it up a little bit. Open hat. And bring down the volume slightly. And then I'll also add a new kind of cymbal called a ride. And then we'll add in one more channel, a MIDI channel with a drum rack on it for toms and other percussion. So let me just grab a tom here. Sounds good. If I drag just a single sample here, it'll start out as a simpler, but I can right click and select group to drum rack, and that'll put it together in a drum rack for me. So now I can add additional toms and percussions later as I need. So I'll zoom in here and let me draw in a 4x4 pattern for the kick on C3, remember, because it's a simpler. Turn up the volume. For the snares and the claps, I'll do the same thing. Snare on the 2 and the 4. And by the way, you can select all the notes and then lengthen them by clicking and dragging from the right. Make them louder. I'll copy the last snare hit onto the clap by pressing Control-C, pressing the up arrow to move that up, and then pressing Control-V to paste the snare back into place. And then I'll program in the same kind of hi-hat pattern that we've had. And this time I'll put a ride cymbal on every beat, which will help emphasize and add more power to the kick drum. And we'll turn all these up. And lastly, to give it a little bit of a moombaton feel, I'll add some tom hits, one here on the last 16th of the first beat and on the next to last 16th of the second beat. And then I'll select those and duplicate that pattern. So together that sounds like this. we'll do a little bit of quick mixing here by looping the beat, or looping the measure. All right, that sounds all right. And to sweeten it up just a little bit more, we'll add in an audio channel. And this is going to be used for some reverse samples that give kind of a sound to it. And setting up reverses in Midi can be tricky because you actually need the end of the sample to line up where you want rather than the beginning. And that's easier to do in when you're manipulating audio. So let me grab another snare here. Maybe sure, that sounds fine. And I'm going to make it reverse in, leading into the second and fourth beat to emphasize the snare and the clap that's there. So I'll drag this in. I'm going to shorten the sample so it just takes up one beat. Then I'm going to right click and select reverse clip. And you'll see that reverses it. And then I'm going to select this and duplicate it so that it also does that before the fourth beat. So together that sounds like this. I'll turn it down a little bit. We could take this one step further by selecting the first track over here, hold down Alt and click this little triangle to collapse everything together. Then holding down Shift, click the kick track and the last audio track to select all the tracks, and press Ctrl G to group them together. Now we can process all of our drum sounds together as a group while also processing them in separate logical units if desired. So we're going to grab another effect called Drum Bus, which is basically a combination of overdrive and saturation with a compressor. And this can be a really nice effect to add on to your drum group in general to give them more punch and thump and texture. So we'll turn on the compressor and we'll bring the dry wet down to maybe 20% because we don't want to overdo it. A little goes a long way here, but that can really beefen up our drums. It sounds like this. And one final thing we can do to give it a little bit of ambient atmosphere to the drums is we can give it a little reverb by going over here to this icon. This is a send, which transfers some amount of the signal to a separate track for processing. If you click down here on the mixer, you can see that this send here called reverb is where the first one goes to by default, letter A. So we're just going to turn this up a little bit. You can see it's also increasing up here. Maybe we'll turn it up to about -30, 35 or so. And that sounds like this. Again, you don't have to drown it in reverb, just a little bit goes a long way. And of course, we'll rename this whole group to drums. And finally, if you don't want to have to set all this up again next time, you can go up to File and save Live Set as Template. Now, in your user library under the Templates folder, you'll see that it creates this place for you to save this setup as a template. And so next time you're making a track, you can start here with all your different drum tracks set up, and you won't have to do as much work up front. There you go. So now you know 4 different workflows for creating drum beats in Ableton. Along the way, we looked at the differences between audio and Midi, the simpler and drum rack instruments, and the drum bus and reverb effects, plus a few other Ableton features. If you've enjoyed our time here together, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you here next time. Happy producing!